Blood test.
Blood test. Blood test. Your blood holds clues about your health.
A lot of people have underlying disease that they don't know that they have.
The #1 killer of both men and women in the United States.
From that one tube of blood, we can predict your 30-year risk of getting heart disease, strokes, heart attacks.
Have you ever wondered what your blood work could reveal about your health? I just got my latest blood test results, and today I am going to dive deep into them with special comments from lipidologist Dr. Thomas Dayspring and practicing physician and endocrinologist Dr. Karl Nadolsky. Spoiler alert, there is one result that caught me off guard. So you want to stick around to find out what that was and what that result might mean for me. And as requested many times by regular listeners of The Proof, thank you so much for tuning in. In this episode, I also address a specific claim made by Dr. Paul Saladino about cholesterol. Yes, we welcome back my friend, Dr. Paul Saladino. Okay, let's get into it, shall we? I think of blood tests like a window into our body's inner workings, and I usually recommend getting a blood test once or twice a year, primarily because trends in your biomarkers can reveal shifts in your health long before symptoms and disease appear. For example, you might catch your HbA1c, a measure of blood glucose control, creeping up before you develop type 2 diabetes. Or you might notice your iron levels are falling before you develop iron deficiency anemia, giving you a chance to intervene before you develop deficiency or disease. Being proactive rather than reactive affords you the opportunity to course correct, be it through lifestyle, supplements, or medicine, before you develop deficiencies and or serious disease. In a way, a blood test is kind of like a smoke detector. It's a tool that can alert you of danger before an inextinguishable fire breaks out. There are two reasons that motivated my decision to walk you through my personal blood test results today, which not everyone online does. First, you might have followed me for 6 or more years at this point, since I started my show. And while you know how I live, the way I eat, the type of exercise I do, which I'll summarize in a moment for anyone new, I've never really walked you through what my blood tests look like in a detailed and systematic way like this. It's one thing to advocate for certain lifestyle behaviors. It's another to do them myself and be living proof that what I'm talking about actually translates into healthy physiology. And second, I hope that by going through my blood tests, and this is the most important part, and pulling experts in to comment on specific results, it may help you better understand your own blood test results and empower you, give you things to discuss with your doctor. The main blood test I did, which included 56 biomarkers, was facilitated by a company in Australia called iScreen. Up front, I have no affiliation with them. It was simply convenient because I didn't have to visit a doctor. I just ordered the tests online, printed them out, and went to a pathology lab, much like Inside Tracker, etc. in the United States. I chose 3 key testing packages, what they call a sports hormone check, an iron check, and a comprehensive thyroid check. These covered all the main biomarkers that I typically like to monitor, things like testosterone, estrogen, sex hormone binding globulin, FSH and LH, which are important for testosterone and sperm production. I'd like to have kids in the coming years. Plus, they also included a full blood count, liver and kidney function, inflammatory markers, blood glucose, cholesterol, iron levels, and markers of thyroid function and metabolism. Most of these are pretty routine, except perhaps the thyroid function tests. But here and there, I do like to look at my thyroid function because both my parents have thyroid conditions. Out of the 56 tests, 55 came back normal, which means 1 didn't. Before I unpack what that test was, what the result means, and whether I need to take action, allow me to add some context to all of my results by going through my lifestyle and health history. I'm 38 years old, 184 centimeters tall, and 90 kilograms, which is about 200 pounds or just shy of. I have no chronic health issues or even pre-chronic conditions like pre-diabetes. My diet is plant-based and protein-rich, about 120 to 150 grams of protein per day from sources like tofu, tempeh, and legumes. But honestly, I don't obsess over protein. I'm not counting it at every meal because while it does generally land in that range, just due to familiarity with protein-rich foods and the types of meals that I make, I'm actually happy with my muscle mass. And so my goal is to just build a little more strength, which comes down to resistance training more than anything else. So I don't obsess over protein. What about the fat that I eat? Again, I don't strictly track my fat intake, but when I do out of curiosity, it's about 30 to 35% of my calories, mostly from unsaturated fats. So no, although my diet is low in saturated fat, it's not low in total fat by any means. I get lots of fats from nuts and seeds and avocado, etc., tofu. I've been somewhat critical of low-fat plant-based diets before. I think unsaturated fats, especially polyunsaturated fats, are not just better than saturated fat, but they're actually inherently heart healthy. And from my experience, people, especially folks in their midlife, feel better with a diet that's not overly restrictive when it comes to total fat intake. That's anecdotal, so take it with a grain of salt. I love fruits, veggies, and fungi. They're staples in pretty much every meal. Dark leafy greens, purple sweet potatoes, zucchini, berries, mushrooms, you name it, the list goes on. I try to eat fermented foods every day. You can pretty much always find kraut in our fridge at home. Plenty of herbs and spices to create extra flavor in meals. Remember, foods like tofu are a vehicle for flavor. You need to flavor them with a marinade or herbs and spices, etc. And I eat my fair share of sprouts. Shout out to Doug Evans. My favorite being radish sprouts, which have that little hit of spice. As for physical activity, I'm pretty active. I move my body daily, combining resistance training with cardio. In total, I clock about 75 to 90 minutes of dedicated exercise each day, plus plenty of steps wherever I can squeeze them in. My body composition, last year I did a DEXA scan in Boston, which showed nearly zero visceral fat and high muscle mass for my age and height. So that seems pretty decent. I was pretty happy with that. I've definitely been leaner in my life, in my 20s perhaps, but over the years I've begun to place more value on my social life, and I'm not prepared to sacrifice that to just have a six-pack all year round. Supplements, I take a multivitamin, DHA, EPA, omega-3s, hyaluronic acid, a prebiotic powder by 38 Terra, creatine, and protein powder. I've detailed the doses and brands that I use in the show notes for those curious. And if you'd like a dedicated episode on this, please let me know in the comments. Finally, I do make a pretty concerted effort to try and go to bed and wake up at a similar time every day. It's by no means perfect, but I try. I get bright light exposure as soon as I wake up, and leading up to bed, I dim the lights and make sure the bedroom is cool. The key here is that most of these lifestyle habits for me run on autopilot. I'm not obsessing over every detail. I believe striving for consistency over decades is far more important than chasing perfection for a few months. I aim to be imperfectly consistent rather than over-optimizing in an attempt to try and reach that ever-elusive state of perfection. And in doing that, I feel like I've been able to ease a lot of anxiety around health and wellness. And actually, if I'm being honest, in preparing for this episode, about sharing my blood test results, I sort of came to the conclusion that I didn't even want to share this information in fear that it could lead to people getting caught up in over-optimization. But I managed to convince myself that I could use this as an opportunity to remind you what's important and perhaps what's not so important. Now that you know a little about my background and health status, so we have that as context to review my blood test results, let's get into the nitty-gritty of my blood work. We'll cover the main results in 3 sections. Cardiometabolic biomarkers. So this includes cholesterol, blood glucose, inflammatory markers, etc. Hormones. This includes testosterone, estrogen, FSH, LH, thyroid hormones, etc. And then iron, so serum iron, ferritin, and I'll also share with you my vitamin B12 and vitamin D results there. Make sure you hang around all the way to the hormone biomarkers, as that's where I had that one result that was deemed abnormal or suboptimal. And for what it's worth, I have converted all of my results so that we have them in both the Australian and US units. Yes, many of you have been asking me for a long time to do that. You can access these via a link in the show notes. Because I'm speaking in this episode with US-based doctors, I'll be referring to the US units for each marker. And while we're on that, a neat little hack here to convert your measurements into US units or vice versa is to use ChatGPT. I found this to be as reliable as the unit conversion calculator at unitslab.com and perform these conversions in a fraction of the time. Thank you, AI. Now, before we get into my blood test results, a quick ad break to introduce you to one of our very important partners, 38 Terra, who helps make these videos available to you at no cost. 38 Terra's DMN prebiotic, which I'm holding up on screen for those watching on YouTube, is a science-based daily multivitamin for your gut microbes. It's what I take each morning before having my coffee. Taking DMN once per day ensures your gut microbes are well fed, and in turn, they will reward you by producing beneficial compounds like short chain fatty acids. Get 10% off your DMN at 38terra.com using the code THEPROOF. That's 38terra.com and use the coupon code THEPROOF for 10% off. Starting with cholesterol. Because iScreen doesn't measure ApoB, the main marker that I'm interested in here is non-HDL cholesterol, which is a pretty good proxy for ApoB as it adds up all of the cholesterol within ApoB containing lipoproteins. My non-HDL cholesterol was 2.28 millimoles per liter, which is equivalent to 88 milligrams per deciliter. The only time that non-HDL and LDL cholesterol are not that great for determining risk of cardiovascular disease is in about 20% of folks who have diabetes, metabolic syndrome, elevated triglycerides, etc., which doesn't apply to me. So in my case, I'm more than happy to use non-HDL here. Because 20% of the population is not a small number, and this is arguably increasing as global metabolic health declines, more and more cardiologists, scientists, and other lipid experts are emphasizing that ApoB is the best test to assess lipoprotein-driven cardiovascular disease. So if your doctor is happy to include ApoB on your next blood test, that would be great. Non-HDL is essentially the second best single biomarker, followed by LDL cholesterol. But given that non-HDL can be found on almost all lipid panels, it makes LDL cholesterol somewhat redundant. A recent review by Momentous et al. Summarized this as, and I quote, "Non-HDL is superior to LDL cholesterol and ApoB is the best choice of them all." While this blood test didn't include ApoB, I had a test done in the United States in May 2024, which did include ApoB, and my ApoB was 69 milligrams per deciliter. Now, to be clear, I'm not recommending you do blood tests this frequently unless directed by a doctor. It is unnecessary. I just happened to have a credit with iScreen that needed to be used before it expired, so I thought, why not use it for educational and academic purposes? I phoned up my buddy, Dr. Thomas Dayspring, to see what he thought of my non-HDL being 88 milligrams per deciliter and ApoB being 69 milligrams per deciliter. Here's what he had to say.
Well, we always look at the numbers, but then we have to understand everything about the patient that those numbers come from. So you're a relatively young man yet in my mind, and you're very healthy. You take care of yourself. You do all the proper lifestyle. Your nutrition is good. So as opposed to if you were calling me up and you had a positive coronary calcium, if you already had a clinical event. So for you, those numbers, I've often discussed population percentile cut points of various lipid and lipoprotein parameters. Are you in the bottom 20th percentile of the population, meaning the human race, or are you higher than that? So for a relatively healthy person without obvious other cardiovascular risks, below the 20th percentile is good. If you were in that higher risk category, I like to see most of the parameters below the 5th percentile. So the numbers you just rattled off to me really put you around the 10th percentile. So with the parameters, so I'd be pretty happy with that. And what, as we always do with lipid parameters, we follow them over time. They're great today, and I don't think it calls for anything more than for you to continue doing what you're doing. But who knows what they'll be a year, 2, 5 years down the road. Or if you suddenly decide to take up smoking, your risk gets worse, and I'd want the numbers a little lower. So no, I'm pretty happy with your numbers, Simon.
Now, fortunately, I don't personally have elevated Lp(a) levels, but I know some listeners might or do. So I was curious to hear what Dr. Dayspring would think about my non-HDL and ApoB levels if I did have elevated Lp(a) of, say, greater than 50 milligrams per deciliter. Lp(a) being an almost entirely genetically determined lipoprotein that significantly raises risk of cardiovascular disease, something that he and I discussed in a previous episode.
In my mind, that's a potentially incredibly atherogenic lipoprotein, which, as you know, is inherited. So I often joke with people like you that you did pick the right mom and dad to at least get that gene from. So as Lp(a) goes up, risk goes up, and it's almost a straight line. The higher it goes up, the worse the risk. But at the level you're talking about there, That's the current treatment for Lp(a), since we have no, at least FDA-approved therapy to lower it, and no randomized blinded trials showing that lowering it is efficacious and what level you should lower it to. But awaiting those trials, we have to respect that that's an at-risk Lp(a). And the current treatment is, the guidelines would tell you to drop your LDL cholesterol lower, and I'm an ApoB guy, so I'm, hey, drop your ApoB down lower. And of course, if you drop ApoB, you're also dropping LDL cholesterol for the most part. So my rule for Lp(a) elevations is those are the people I almost treat like, hey, you've got serious coronary disease. I want your ApoB below the 5th percentile, which would be 60 milligrams per deciliter. And the LDL cholesterol in that neighborhood also.
There's research showing that at physiologic levels of LDL cholesterol, around 20 to 40 milligrams per deciliter, humans do not develop atherosclerosis. I've had people say to me on X or Twitter before, why don't you take a statin or some other lipid-lowering drug to get your levels down further in order to completely stop this pathology from developing? That is an interesting question. Another question that I had for Dr. Dayspring.
Well, Simon, if you live to be 100, maybe when we looked at your arteries when you're 80 years old, there would be some subclinical plaque there. So you mentioned the physiologic ApoB levels. That's basically called hypobeta-lipoproteinemia. It's below 50 milligrams per deciliter. And we know from the studying people with various genetic issues who do have hypobeta-lipoproteinemia, they do not get any degree of atherosclerosis over time. But that does not mean that we have to make every single person on the globe have a physiologic ApoB level, because that would lead to a lot of unnecessary, even expensive treating to achieve those type of ApoB levels. So again, I go back to what I just told you. I see no other risk factors in you. You're leading the good life. You're working hard to keep your health good. So I see no real reason to make you achieve quote unquote hypobeta-lipoproteinemia. I mean, if I could snap my fingers and give you a different genome and it would happen, all right, but I don't really see you at risk with your current levels. But also, as I indicate, we're going to follow you over time. And if you're one of the going to get into trouble with your current ApoB levels, it's going to take a long time. I'll be long gone. You'll find a new lipidologist by then. But no, I don't think you have to force physiologic ApoB levels on everybody. I wish we were all born that way. The overwhelming majority of us are not, but not all of us have to go down to that level. I think where we push for physiologic ApoB is the very high Lp(a)s, other severe genetic disorders, or somebody's already had atherothrombotic events.
iScreen also provided triglycerides, HDL, cholesterol, and total cholesterol, all of which were deemed to be in the desirable range. On that note, I don't really pay attention to total cholesterol too much because LDL cholesterol, non-HDL cholesterol, or ideally ApoB are all much better predictors of coronary artery disease. I also don't really pay attention to HDL for reasons that Dr. Dayspring summarized here.
Oh yeah, we've radically changed our belief on that through what? Continuing studies that we didn't know about 20, 30 years ago. So we were trying to explain things on older, mostly observational data that we have. Once, the randomized controlled trials coming in, and as you know, we developed the skills with all the genetic studies being done to do Mendelian randomization trials. And those trials can correlate various genes that are associated with various lipid metrics. And oh boy, if you inherited these genes and you have low HDL cholesterol or you have high HDL cholesterol, were the people with the genes associated with low HDL cholesterol dying prematurely of heart disease, and were the people with the genes that generates high HDL cholesterol having longevity? And we found out, at least genetic-wise, there was no relationship to the genes that regulate HDLs and what's going to happen to you down the road. But clinical trials showed the exactly same things. We performed several clinical trials using different drugs that had the ability to raise HDL cholesterol. And guess what? We raised HDL cholesterol nicely in the various trials and didn't reduce a single atherosclerotic event. So that basically killed the observational, the Framingham type of HDL cholesterol data that went back 40 to 50 years ago. In retrospect, we've gone back to studies like Framingham or other studies that suggest that low HDL cholesterol was so dangerous. We find out, if you adjust for ApoB, HDL cholesterol becomes irrelevant. They now say, all those people who were getting heart attacks because their HDL cholesterol was low, what caused their low HDL cholesterol was the high triglycerides. When you have high triglycerides, you have high ApoB particles that for a variety of reasons cannot be efficiently cleared at the liver. So high trigs almost universally means high ApoB, and high trigs almost universally means low HDL cholesterol. So the goal of therapy now, if you either have high trigs or low HDL cholesterol, no guideline gives you a specific trig to shoot for, and none include any HDLC goals of therapy because they know that's futile. But what they do suggest is that in people with low HDL cholesterol or high triglycerides, you get ApoB to goal. Now, of course, the guidelines say get non-HDL cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol are poor man's surrogates of ApoB to goal.
In short, while at one point in time it was thought that HDL cholesterol was protective against heart disease, genetic studies and randomized controlled trials have both failed to demonstrate benefit, be it with genetically elevated HDL or increasing HDL with a drug. For completeness, as mentioned just before, my triglycerides were considered optimal. Mine were 0.6 millimoles per liter, which is 53 milligrams per deciliter. A lot of people, including my friend Dr. Paul Saladino, believe that ApoB is overhyped and suggest that instead we should be focusing on the triglyceride to HDL ratio in milligrams per deciliter as a proxy for insulin resistance. Paul claims that you want your triglyceride to HDL ratio to be under 2 as an indication that you have good metabolic health. You're not suffering from insulin resistance, and therefore you don't have to worry about your high ApoB or high LDL cholesterol. His point being that whether or not ApoB or LDL cholesterol is atherogenic depends on context. If you're metabolically healthy, his position, as far as I can tell, is that you need not worry about your ApoB or LDL cholesterol level. He thinks we're blaming the wrong thing. For what it's worth, let's entertain this notion that triglyceride to HDL ratio is a marker of metabolic health for just a moment. After converting my results to milligrams per deciliter, my triglyceride to HDL ratio is 1.1, well below Paul's less than 2 recommendation. Back to Paul's claim that it's metabolic health, as indicated by triglyceride to HDL ratio or even HDL itself, that matters, not ApoB. I think we need to put this under the microscope. Now, so you know that I'm not misrepresenting Paul, trying to represent his position as best as possible, here he is discussing this very claim on the Minimalist podcast.
If you look at the Framingham data overall, as you go up, it's a straight line that kind of goes up to the right, meaning the more cholesterol, the more heart disease. But if you break the cohort down by a third variable, and that variable gives you some indication of your metabolic health or your insulin sensitivity, a very different pattern emerges. And you get 4 lines based on the metric that I've seen used is HDL cholesterol. So HDL is canonically thought of as good cholesterol, but it's much more complicated than that. But in this case, HDL is a good proxy for insulin sensitivity because generally people who are more insulin resistant, which is synonymous with prediabetes and diabetes, have lower HDL. Diabetics tend to waste HDL. It's just human physiology that a pre-diabetic or diabetic state results in higher triglycerides and lower HDL. So if you subfractionate the total cohort of the Framingham study by HDL, you get 4 lines, right? HDL less than 25 or 25 or less, HDL 25 to 50, HDL 50 to 75, or HDL above 75. You can choose whatever cutoffs you want. And the people with the highest HDL, these are people who are going to have generally insulin sensitivity. They're going to be metabolically healthy, right? People with the lowest HDL, most likely to be diabetic, pre-diabetic, insulin resistant, okay? Follow me so far?
Yep.
The people with the highest HDL in the Framingham cohort have basically a straight line that's flat. They don't have any connection between the amount of LDL in their body and the incidence of coronary heart disease.
Oh, wow.
The people with, or like a very, very small upslope, very small.
Now, please note, before I get to my main point here, something I want to make very clear is that Paul is referring in this clip to the Framingham study, which is an observational population or epidemiology study, a type of science that he usually says is highly unreliable. The fact that he's decided to cite it here to support his argument, well, that's a story for another day. Let's keep going. While there is definitely some truth to what Paul is saying, that people with poor metabolic health have a higher risk of coronary artery disease, his claim that risk does not increase or only slightly increases as cholesterol goes up in metabolically healthy individuals is something I would disagree with. Paul's own graph, which he refers to in this clip and also in his episode on the Joe Rogan podcast, shows this. And I believe that graph comes from a 1977 paper published on the Framingham study, as far as I can tell anyway. For those watching on YouTube, I've put the graph that Paul is referring to on screen. And for those listening along on audio, I'll do my best to explain it. It's clear that the group with the highest HDL, which Paul says suggests that they are most metabolically healthy, still have an almost doubling in risk of coronary artery disease as their cholesterol goes up. When you plot that group of subjects, those with the highest HDL, on a graph by themselves, that doubling in risk becomes more obvious, which I'm showing on screen now. Sure, granted that their risk isn't the same as someone who has poor metabolic health and high LDL cholesterol, but that's kind of expected. In one scenario, you are stacking multiple risk factors, and the other, you just have one. To say that there's no increased risk in coronary artery disease or little increased risk with high cholesterol as long as you're insulin sensitive is just inaccurate. Furthermore, and maybe Paul just missed this, but there's a specific paper on the Framingham offspring cohort published in 2016, so much more recent than the 1977 paper he cites, which again shows that low LDL cholesterol results in a lower risk of coronary artery disease than high LDL cholesterol, even in the context of high HDL cholesterol and low triglycerides, i.e., even when people are metabolically healthy per Paul's definition, it's better to have lower LDL cholesterol. One of the main reasons that high LDL cholesterol, or ApoB, still increases risk of atherosclerosis in metabolically healthy people is because the cells that line artery walls, endothelial cells, they can be compromised at specific locations in the arterial system simply due to the high pressure local environment that they're in, unlike endothelial cells in veins, which are in a much lower pressure environment. This local environment is enough for ApoB containing lipoproteins, like low density lipoproteins, to cross into the artery wall, become retained, and kickstart an inflammatory process that leads to atherosclerosis, cholesterol being deposited in the artery wall. And this happens when ApoB or LDL cholesterol rises above those physiologic levels. Here's a quote from a recent review on this. Atherosclerotic lesions in the arterial tree often occur, especially at bifurcations, i.e. at sites exposed to turbulent blood flow leading to mechanical shear stress on the vessel wall that affects the endothelial cell homeostasis by, for example, pro-inflammatory activation. Interestingly, lesions do not develop in veins under normal environment of low pressure and high flow. But when veins are used as arterial bypass, for example, aortocoronary venous bypass, they may develop atherosclerotic lesions, probably because they are subjected to high pressure. End quote. The take-home point being that at a certain concentration, cholesterol on its own is enough to cause atherosclerosis in arteries, even with good metabolic health, because arteries are prone to damage, simply because they're arteries, and blood is being pumped through them under high amounts of pressure. Keep LDL cholesterol down to physiologic levels, 20 to 40 milligrams per deciliter, and there's not enough of these lipoproteins to pose a threat. Here's another quote from Peter Libby, preventative cardiologist and professor at Harvard Medical School, that speaks to this. And I quote, "If the entire population maintained LDL concentrations akin to those of a neonate or to those of adults of most other animal species, atherosclerosis might well be an orphan disease." meaning that atherosclerosis, the number one cause of death globally, would be incredibly rare. With this in mind, my view is to optimize both. Get ApoB to goal depending on your risk profile and be insulin sensitive, i.e. have good metabolic health, which per the results that I've just shared with you is what my lifestyle has helped me achieve. Paul's way of eating optimizes his insulin sensitivity, but because of the large amounts of saturated fats that he's consuming, it comes at the expense of his ApoB. My way of eating optimizes insulin sensitivity and ApoB. And while we're on this topic of insulin sensitivity and metabolic health, let's dig into my blood test results a little more. My fasting glucose was considered to be desirable at 4.9 millimoles per liter. And a few months back with Inside Tracker, my fasting insulin was considered optimized at 3.9. Next up is high sensitivity CRP, a general marker of inflammation. My HS CRP was less than 0.4 milligrams per liter. This is considered very low and well within the desirable range. And if you caught my recent video on omega-3s, you would know that I had my omega-3 index tested in the last few months by OmegaQuant, and it was 9.44%, well within the desirable 8 to 12% range. So my risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes is looking really good based on these markers: optimal ApoB, good insulin sensitivity, low inflammation, and an optimal omega-3 index, with nothing further to investigate other than possibly a CT angiography for interest's sake as I approach 40 years of age. I asked Dr. Dayspring what he thought about that, getting a CT angiography, and whether it would change our clinical approach.
It could change the game. If we saw some soft plaque in you, would that twist my arm to say, hey, let's drop Simon's ApoB to that 5th percentile or so? It probably, we'd have to have that discussion, but it probably would.
Allow me to introduce you to Momentous, my go-to supplement brand for all things protein and creatine. It's pretty easy, especially if you're not tracking everything that you eat, to fall short of the optimal daily protein intake. To help reach my daily protein target, I complement my diet with 1.5 scoops of Momentous' chocolate or vanilla chai plant-based protein for 30 grams of protein and all essential amino acids, which supports muscle growth, hormone and collagen production, skin health, and recovery. I also consume 10 grams of Momentous' creatine daily to enhance energy production, muscle strength, bone health, and cognition, with studies now showing the benefit of creatine on short-term memory and intelligence. I'll do anything for a little extra brain power. And what's really cool is that both products are NSF certified. This certification is the only third-party certification program trusted by the likes of the NBA, the MLB, Ironman, etc. With this, you can be confident that Momentous' protein and creatine are free from unsafe levels of contaminants, prohibited substances, or masking agents, and that what is on the label actually matches what is in the product. For discounts on these supplements, visit livemomentous.com and use code LIVINGPROOF for up to 36% off on subscriptions or 20% off one-time purchases. That's livemomentous.com with code LIVINGPROOF at checkout.
Okay, let's move on to hormones. I'm showing a list of the hormones that were measured on screen for those watching on YouTube, and for those listening, I'll quickly list them. The test included total testosterone, free testosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, estradiol, FSH, LH, progesterone, prolactin, cortisol, DHEAS, IGF-1, TSH, free T4, free T3, and reverse T3. At a high level, every single marker here came back as desirable except one, which we'll be sure to cover soon, so stay tuned. I hopped on a call with endocrinologist Dr. Karl Nadolsky to walk through some of these results and get his feedback on whether or not I should focus on improving any of these markers. As you'll hear from Dr. Nadolsky, some of these tests are unnecessary. So we're discussing them more for academic purposes, and it really is worth keeping this in mind. You don't need to rush out and test all of these unless an endocrinologist who understands your clinical presentation and history recommends doing so. I started off by asking Dr. Nadolsky what the most important hormones are to test for someone like me. a healthy 38-year-old male that's interested in continuing to feel energetic and strong and plans to have kids?
This is the great first question, and why so many people out there are making tons of money kind of getting people to order these tests. The bottom line is I wouldn't test any. For the most part. Now there are other factors, right? So when we think about screening, big population-based screening, that's where a lot of, government, but also scientific organizations do a lot of data digging and statistical analysis to figure out, well, what is potentially beneficial? So, what's the prevalence and all that stuff of some sort of disease process. And then if we screen everyone for it, what are the pros, cons, risks, benefits of finding abnormalities and then disease and then doing something about it? And do we benefit from that? And so from a pure hormone perspective, there aren't really any that are just recommended across the board for healthy 38-year-old guys to check hormones. Now, we could debate, I think we're going to talk about a little family history for one of the hormone potential things, and then that gets, debatable, and it's an individualized sort of thing. But as far as just across the board, really nothing. We could say, well, there's some debate for almost all adults as to what point we need to start checking lipids, like you talked to Dr. Dayspring about. And, I'm sure he would argue that we need to check everyone kind of early on because we really want to prevent those things. But from a pure hormone perspective, none that are just, yep, hey, everyone would check it. I'm 44. Oh my God, I'm going to be 45 soon. I would not just check anything on myself beyond, say, academic purposes, which of course we've all done, like doctors have all done, but otherwise I wouldn't unless I had specific reasons, symptoms that suddenly increase the clinical concern that something might be wrong that we need to figure out and treat.
My total testosterone was 23 nanomoles per liter, which is 660 nanograms per deciliter, and free testosterone was 375 picomoles per liter, which is 10.8 nanograms per deciliter. Interestingly, these seem to fluctuate quite a bit, with another blood test earlier this year showing my total testosterone was 807 nanograms per deciliter and free testosterone 17 nanograms per deciliter. My assumption is that travel and changes in sleep quantity and quality and time of day explain these differences. Here's what Dr. Nadolsky had to say about my testosterone levels and when someone may want to test their own testosterone levels.
That is absolutely awesome, normal, no concerns with it. So this goes back to, well, who should we even screen for testosterone? And certainly anybody who has sudden change in symptoms, especially like libido, sexual thoughts, desires, over a little bit longer term, maybe like muscle mass doesn't seem to make sense, facial hairs, those androgen things, the things that happen during male puberty. Certainly in the pediatric world, I'm not a pediatrician, but, if puberty is halted, something happens, or they never progress through puberty. There are a lot of genetic or acquired causes of hypothalamic pituitary testicular disease, genetic causes of actual primary testicular disease. And those things they'll trigger screening for sure. And then there are people who are at high risk of, some sort of development, like if someone has a pituitary tumor. Well, they're a high risk for having what we call secondary hypogonadism, where the pituitary isn't stimulating the testicles and have some sort of problem. We could argue that people who have a history of anabolic steroid use, of course, because that causes low testosterone hypogonadism. Maybe glucocorticoids like prednisone, like our natural cortisol anti-inflammatory steroids. Too much of those are very bad. And the most common cause of too much of that type of hormone is medicine. But sometimes people have to be on them for a variety of reasons. And also opioid pain medicines. They cause, sort of just a suppression, or what we can talk about a functional sort of hypogonadism. Those oftentimes are reversible, but, not all the time, right? So those should be screened for. But mostly, if someone like you came in to the primary care doctor and then ultimately probably end up seeing me, you might say, I'm 38, I'm in great shape. I've always been really muscular. I don't even think about sexual activity anymore. I'm not getting erections. Again, if it were kind of cooking, something underlying cooking for a longer period of time. Your muscle mass, you're like, I've been lifting weights forever. I'm always strong. People used to think I'm on steroids, but I'm not on steroids. What's going on? And we would check a morning fasting right when you wake up, essentially 8 a.m. Testosterone. I assume that's when you did it. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't have looked so good.
As mentioned, my test included luteinizing hormone, or LH, which is responsible for signaling to the cells in the testes to produce sperm, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, which is responsible for telling cells in the testes to produce testosterone. Both of these were right in the middle of the desirable range. I asked Dr. Nadolsky if this meant that my pituitary gland was working well to signal to the testes to make testosterone and sperm.
Exactly. Yeah. And in fact, the LH and FSH is essentially useless unless there is a testosterone problem. Does that make sense? So like, they could have been lower, they could have been higher, and I'd not know really I wouldn't care. I wouldn't know what they mean exactly, and I wouldn't really care because I know everything's working correctly because your testosterone was so good. So yeah, I mean, those. Now, on the other hand, there are some, especially with some congenital, like testicular disorders, or older men who are starting to have true testicular failure, where we might be able to see an early compensated primary, meaning testicular hypogonadism, when the LH and especially the FSH are starting to go up. So let's just say, we checked, you're having symptoms, something's weird, you're maybe infertile. We're doing an infertility evaluation. You've been having unprotected sexual intercourse for 6 months. Your wife's getting checked out, should be able to have kids, and something's wrong, and we check you. We do certainly a testosterone screening for that, and your testosterone is 300, and we're like, okay. And we'll talk about sex hormone binding globulin and the free testosterone, because that can alter that total too, by the way. But that FSH was like pretty elevated. I'd say, something's going on. And that may lead to genetic testing and a whole pathway where we'd get reproductive teams involved and stuff like that.
As noted earlier, my blood test also included estradiol, progesterone, prolactin, cortisol, IGF-1, and DHEAS. All of these results were considered to be desirable, and Dr. Nadolsky reiterated that they were, for the most part, not tests that I needed to order as a healthy 38-year-old male with no clinical symptoms. Both my parents have thyroid conditions. My mum has Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, and my dad has Graves' disease, and both take thyroxine, a synthetic form of T4. With that in mind, I wondered whether someone like me who feels energetic and is not experiencing rapid weight gain or loss should keep an eye on thyroid function tests.
Potentially, yes, in this case. That's why I said we'll specify a little bit more in your case, because yeah, you have a high risk of thyroid disease. So Hashimoto's is what your mom almost certainly has, unless there's something else, like if she for some reason had a risk of iodine deficiency, which long time ago, and in some parts of the world, was the leading cause of goiter and hypothyroidism. Well, in the United States and Australia and most places, we iodize our salt. So we should not be iodine deficient. If people had obviously surgery or radiation to their neck, some cause of actual thyroid disease, or again, by the way, with more rare, but hypothalamic and pituitary disease, we have to talk about. But basically, other than that, it's autoimmune thyroiditis, Hashimoto's, which is what people call it. We don't have to check antibodies for that necessarily when people have obvious hypothyroidism, because that's basically what it is. Now, that's pretty common. 15% of females in the United States have Hashimoto's, and if they don't have hypothyroidism already, they have an increased risk of it. You also have an increased risk of other autoimmune diseases, which kind of ironically includes Graves' disease, which we'll talk about what that is. But other autoimmune diseases like what I see, type 1 diabetes, adrenal insufficiency, which we kind of touched on a little bit, but also celiac disease. These things are more rare, but they're a little bit more common in people who have Hashimoto's. So you kind of have a double whammy, because then your dad has history of Graves, a little bit more rare, but it's an autoimmune disease where antibodies now stimulate those thyroid stimulating hormone receptors on the thyroid, causing hyperproduction of thyroid hormone, which is very dangerous, even in the short term. And if untreated and something else goes wrong, that can lead to something rare but very bad we call thyroid storm, where the organs essentially start to fail. That's bad news. So we don't want to let this stuff go away. Presumably he had it treated with like radioactive iodine or surgery, since he's on thyroid hormone now. Yeah, so we have anti-thyroid medicines that we use probably more frequently than anything now, because we can kind of minimize those, let people stay at bay. And Graves can go into remission, by the way. And so you do absolutely. So if you were like, hey, I want to see an endocrinologist just because I want to kind of talk about my risk and get especially your TSH, monitored every once in a while, I'd say that's probably reasonable. We could debate at a much higher level of medicine and science on the statistical, purposes of that, but it's probably pretty reasonable in your case to monitor that. But also I would tell anybody, and this goes for anybody who has like known Hashimoto's, but their thyroid's working and everything's fine. I'd say very low threshold to check anytime anything changes. Like if you're like, something's not right, just check it. So in your case, if something was wrong, if you were like, wow, it's 90 degrees out and I'm really happy. And in fact, I'm a little cool and I'm going to wear my sweatshirt. Yeah, you should probably get it checked.
So what exactly are the most important thyroid tests to check?
Generally speaking, the only one that's really necessary and helpful if we're talking about the thyroid itself, and in your case, would be the TSH, because it is pretty stable, and small changes in the thyroid function will cause relatively big changes in the TSH.
Interestingly, my thyroid panel included much more than TSH. In addition to TSH, it included free T3, free T4, thyroid antibodies, and also reverse T3. I'm showing the results on screen, and as a reminder, they're also available to read via the show notes. Here's what Karl had to say about my thyroid function based on these test results and my family history.
Yeah, well, you actually got your antibodies checked, which again, there's no, I don't know that, anybody would say, oh my God, I can't believe you did that specifically because of your situation. If you came to me and said, look, my mom has hypothyroidism, my dad had Graves, had it treated, can I check my antibodies? Yes. Not that big of a deal. You know what I mean? I would have checked, we may not have gotten a free T3, but we probably would have, to be honest, because it's not that big of a deal to add it in. And so you actually don't have those antibodies. Now, going forward, there's no real reason to check those. That doesn't mean you don't have the risk. So your thyroid is awesome right now. It is functioning appropriately. There's no concern of disease. You don't even have the antibodies putting you at increased risk. So what I'd say to you is, could you argue you want your TSH checked, especially once you get to the age where you really are getting things checked, like you're monitoring your sugar, your blood sugar, your kidneys, your lipids, all these different things. They'll probably throw in a TSH. It's not that big of a deal. You just have to be aware that if it's abnormal, you should probably recheck it. Don't start acting upon it immediately. Hold the course. A few months later, recheck it, because 70% of the time these things just go back to normal because maybe you had an inflammation, like I was talking about the thyroiditis or something. But I would absolutely have a lower threshold to check it if I were you.
My blood test included reverse T3, and this was on the upper end of the normal range, which is what led to one of my 46 blood tests being undesirable, my free T3 to reverse T3 ratio. A quick search online reveals many practitioners claiming that high reverse T3, an inactive form of T3, can impair the ability of T3 to bind to thyroid receptors, resulting in hypothyroidism-like symptoms: fatigue, sluggishness, weight gain, intolerance of cold temperatures, etc. I don't personally have any of these symptoms, but was still curious if this meant that my thyroid was somewhat misbehaving. So I asked Karl what he thought about reverse T3.
So this is like the classic lab that the quacks tell everyone to order. And then they'll say, oh, if your doctor doesn't order this, he doesn't know what he's doing. Well, I can guarantee they're not the ones who did the research on it. It was the mainstream, scientific endocrinologist, clinical endocrinologist, whatever, who did all the studies on this stuff. And so no, in almost all cases, it's worthless. It's not going to do anything. It's an inactive metabolite of T4, essentially. It's like the alternative doctors, functional medicine doctors, they'll check it to justify the use of T3 and sell supplements to try to enhance that conversion of T4 to actual T3.
What about the claim or idea that reverse T3 binds to the T3 receptor on cells, blocking T3 from binding and thus slowing metabolism?
Yeah, and they always pull a hint of truth from something and then make a big deal about it. That means nothing. It's clinically irrelevant. Now, if you are under significant stressors, different medications, losing weight beyond what's appropriate, anorexia, all these different things, you will cause kind of that, what I was talking about, that non-thyroidal type illness, almost kind of a suppression, just like we mentioned functional hypogonadism. People like, natural bodybuilders or wrestlers like we were, although Spencer didn't cut weight because he was a heavyweight. I had to cut weight. I remember being probably 4% body fat and having no libido because I was probably hypogonadal, functionally. But the same sort of thing happens with the thyroid. So that's part of how your metabolism goes down. And, and that's just normal physiology. So, it kind of goes back to, good nutrition, exercise, sleep, not anything extreme or excessive if you truly want to optimize it. But it also, it's just part of physiology. So it's not something to worry about. And like I said, as far as the functional docs saying, what are they going to do with the information? Nothing. They don't know what it means. But they might say, I'm going to sell you this supplement and we can give you T3. Well, we can give you T3 regardless if everything seems right and you have specific hypothyroid symptoms and we make sure there's nothing else going on. The problem with these functional medicine docs and alternative docs, they think everything is just a few different things. They tell everyone, I get these referrals all the time, drives me insane. Everyone has adrenal fatigue. Everyone has high reverse T3 and they're going to give them these supplements. Everyone has, they have some sort of leaky gut. I mean, that's what they tell everybody. And it drives me insane. And then those people don't get the real issue figured out. They have anemia. They have real endocrine disease. They have sleep apnea that's untreated. All these different things that those people are not actually holistic, but they hijacked that term. All medical schools and residencies and fellowships literally focus on being holistic. And yet the alternative functional people hijacked it and said, nope, we're the only ones holistic. And then they're not. It's very ironic.
In fairness to iScreen, who performed this blood test, they did at least provide some type of disclaimer about reverse T3. And I quote, "The role of reverse T3 is not well established in the scientific literature and may not be of significance outside of specialist treatment monitoring in thyroid disease." End quote. So the one test that I had outside of the normal range seems to be something that I don't even need to worry about. A reminder for all of us that ordering a battery of tests isn't always a good idea. If a test isn't validated and doesn't change clinical decision making, there's really no point ordering it. It's only likely to cause unnecessary stress. Finally, iron. I've never had iron issues. The multivitamin that I take has 12 milligrams of non-heme iron in it, and I get plenty of non-heme iron through my diet. My serum iron levels were towards the mid to upper part of the desirable range. My iron stores, as measured by ferritin, were well within the desirable range, but towards the lower end of that range, which is very common, very typical for people following plant-based diets. And this might actually be a good thing, with high iron stores being associated with several disease states, including cardiovascular disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, metabolic syndrome, and also diabetes. While this mechanism is not fully understood, it's thought that excess stored iron increases free radical production, unstable atoms that can cause cellular damage, provoking oxidative stress and inflammation. You might be wondering, what about other vitamins and minerals, important micronutrients? The iScreen test that I did didn't test for other micronutrients. I didn't include them as I checked them a few months earlier. The ones I keep an eye on mostly are vitamin D and vitamin B12, which as of just a few months ago were both great. And that makes perfect sense. My daily multivitamin includes both of those, vitamin B12 and vitamin D, along with other nutrients of focus such as iodine, zinc, and selenium. Okay, I think we did it. To summarize, the main lifestyle habits that I personally focus on that have helped me optimize these important blood biomarkers are: number 1, eat a plant-rich diet. For you, this could be plant predominant or plant exclusive, which could be a Mediterranean diet, a pescatarian diet, a vegetarian diet, or a vegan diet. One thing to keep in mind is as you go further along that spectrum, there is a little more planning that's required to avoid micronutrient gaps. Personally, I love the Danish dietary guidelines, which I've linked in the show notes as a starting template. Number 2, avoid being sedentary. Find a way to incorporate cardiovascular exercise and resistance training into your life on a regular basis, at least 4 to 5 days a week. And if you find cardio boring, think of an activity that you love, like hiking, surfing, pickleball, tennis, etc. So it doesn't feel like such a hard grind. As a general rule of thumb, I like the idea of a minimum 2 days a week resistance training, totaling at least 2 hours per week, and 3 days a week dedicated cardiovascular exercise, totaling at least 2.5 hours per week. If you think about that, that's only 4.5 hours of exercise per week, which represents just 2.6% of our time each and every week. A pretty achievable entry point for most of us. Number 3, use supplements strategically to complement a healthy diet. And number 4, set up a sleep routine. As best as you can, regular bed and wake times, sleeping in a cool, dark room, avoiding bright light late at night, and exposing yourself to bright light upon waking or soon after. And that's it. My latest blood test results with some expert commentary along the way. Thank you, Dr. Dayspring. Thank you, Dr. Nadolsky. Hopefully this acts as a nice overview of things to focus on or not focus on when you're reviewing your own labs. Of course, remember your circumstances are going to be unique, so please consider that. It's always best to discuss your results with a doctor that understands your health history, your goals, and your clinical presentation. I just want to be super clear that this information doesn't replace the importance of having a personal relationship with a doctor who can help guide you with evidence-based advice tailored to your unique circumstances. And that's a wrap for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Remember to be kind to yourself and others. And I can't wait to connect with you again soon. Take care. Still here? Well, I guess that means one thing. You're after a dad joke. Why can't you hear a pterodactyl go to the bathroom? Because the P is silent. Okay. And with that, I'll see you in the comments. Bye for now.